This is Shalom World Podcast.
Have you ever thought about the clash between our digital world and what's right and wrong? That's where The Porn Disaster comes in, a series that dives into one of society's most hush-hush topics. Get ready for some real talk as we dig into the ups and downs of today's tech-driven desires. Kids, relationships, recovery, we're not holding back. From the Catholic Church's take on porn to why our brains get hooked, we cover it all. Join us as we chat about the messy stuff, the good, the bad, and the uncomfortable. Hosted by Patricia Keane, we've got an expert panel here to chat about porn addiction, what it does, how it affects us, and how we can heal.
Hello, welcome to Shalom World. My name is Patricia Keane and we are coming to you from Maynooth, County Kildare in Ireland. I'm here presenting a 12-part series on pornography called The Porn Disaster. In today's episode, we are going to be looking at recovery, where it begins, how it happens, can you recover without external help, and what are the recovery tools for the program. First of all, I want to welcome my guests for episode 11.
Professor Patricia Casey, Professor of Psychiatry at University College Dublin, Ireland. She is a psychiatrist, journalist, and commentator on social issues. Father Chris Hayden, priest from the Diocese of Ferns, Ireland, Spiritual Director, St. Patrick's Seminary, Maynooth. Father Alan Hoffa, priest from the Diocese of Allentown, USA. He has BA in Philosophy and Masters in Divinity. Dr. Kielty Oberlin, she's from Ireland, doctorate in Psychology and Masters in Counseling, specializing in eating disorder recovery.
This episode is really around recovery. And it is pinging on everything that we've learned around recovery. So I'm going to begin with you. Okay, so where does recovery begin?
Recovery begins when a person acknowledges that they have a problem. And that alone can be a challenging place, because I think denial is actually, we expect denial at first. I mean, for example, a lot of people are in denial that pornography is a problem, despite all that we've been talking about. And so somebody can be living with pornography addiction where they're compulsively watching and it's taking away from their lives, it's impacting their mental health, their relationships, and yet still be in denial, thinking that, okay, I can just stop, maybe struggling to stop. So the next step is coming to admit that I need help. And I think the other bit is truly what I think anybody who is struggling with it or has a loved one that knows that that is struggling is to say that support is out there and to be able to be that support for the person. And the thing is, there's help, there's education, because the first step, I always say this when we're dealing with helping anybody or when we ourselves are going through something, is to find out the best resource to understand it better. And Fathers Here and Integrity Restored is a fabulous resource that will support both parents, loved ones, but there are treatment providers, there's education online, there's support groups. So it is in that regard. So understanding that supports are there. And I think the other really challenging thing about recovery from pornography, and my other field that you've mentioned before, is eating disorders, which is it's a process addiction. And this is similar in that the recovery journey is long and tedious, and just to be ready, it's a long, because most people think if I just stop whatever it is, then things will be okay. But in fact, stopping is actually the first step, because stopping unlocks the ability to be able to look at what is underneath that, what hurts, what traumas, to be able to heal that, to be able to heal broken relationships, find other things in life that we can be passionate about and engage with. And so opening up all these parts of our lives that, because we've been investing in pornography or another addiction, have had very little time. We haven't been able to develop that. I could go on. The thing is, recovery is my thing.
I think one of the big things, as in what we do at Integrity Restored, and a large part of this from a faith perspective, is I go around and I train priests to be ready for that first point of contact. Because in the church, confession oftentimes becomes that first point of contact when a person comes into the confessional and says, I have had a problem with pornography, it's been repetitious. And so what we counsel, or what we educate priests to do, is to work with them from getting them from the confessional into the pastoral counseling office dynamic, where then there can be almost a triage. And in that, the person comes to say about first encounter, the history, where they are now, frequency, all of those important pieces that then we train the priest to be able to say, you know what, this has reached a point where a clinician is really needed. And then we walk with them, putting them in the driver's seat to let them know that they're in control, but to support them in getting into that connection with the clinician. And from there, the road to recovery happens. But the other piece of this is that when we do that, people often ask, what type of clinician are we looking for? And it would be great if we had someone that was Catholic or Christian, faith-based, and also has a background with sexual addiction, with trauma. Sometimes you can't find that depending on where you are and the resources that are around you. So the way that you complement that is by having a priest or a spiritual director or a spiritual guide who can then complement what the clinician is doing, who has the background with the sexual addiction, with the addiction background, with the trauma background. But it has to be integrated. We've already stated this is not something that can be prayed away, but at the same time, it can't just be something that can be dealt with on a secular psychological level, because there needs to be that understanding of wholeness, and the way that God created the human person is a large part of this. And I think that I'm going to pass the ball to my friend Professor Casey here, because one of the things that we've been talking about is the fact that in recovery, one of the things that you don't want to fall into is, while it's important to acknowledge that you have a problem, you also have to commit to the full process. What we call white knuckle sobriety or white knuckle recovery, where you're just barely holding on, is never healthy. And I think that you had something to say about that.
That's absolutely right. If people are just barely hanging on in there and struggling with it and hoping that they can pray it away, or that just going to generic counselling to talk about it. You have to have somebody who is trained in this. So just going through the process of generic counselling, or just hoping it will go away, or just doing your own self-help with it, isn't going to work. And part of it is not just acknowledging the problem, but acknowledging it emotionally. There are a lot of people out there who know all the theory about addictions. They'll have read up all about the scans and about the screening instruments for it, and about the theory behind it, the neurochemicals in the brain that we talked about earlier. And you might be, if you were a therapist and maybe a novice therapist, you might think that person really has insight and they should do very well. In fact, that's what's called intellectual insight. It's not emotional insight. The person must really, from the bottom of their heart, want to make the change and want to live with the implication of not being able to, in the future, turn on the screen, cope with the discomfort of that. And learn how to manage that discomfort. And that's where the trained therapist comes in.
Go ahead, Kielty, please.
Just one thing I'm going to chat, but the word want. So many clients will come and say, what I want is this to be over, but I don't actually want to let go. Mm-hmm. And that's why I'm just saying about the word want, because a lot of people will think and have said to me, well, if I don't want it, then it won't happen. And I'm like, well, hold on, we're different ways of motivating. We can motivate in away from the negative consequences that we don't want, and that we're trying to avoid. And over time, that want for that better life will kick in because of the depression or the isolation. If there's more fear involved, they're almost afraid of the fear of change as well. So I just say that for anybody that's listening, that's like, but I don't want to let go yet, So, but yeah, everything else fabulous.
I mean, it has to be timed, that it happens when the person is ready to let
Ready is
readiness,
the word.
I think is probably the word.
Ready is the word.
And that concept I said about accompaniment is putting them in the driver's seat, because it's encouraging them and letting them know the steps, but they have to want to do it. And if it's forced upon them, it really doesn't take, and it dissolves.
What would hinder that want? What would be the roadblocks?
Fear. Mostly fear of, and because of what Patricia just said, it's that emotional journey, and a lot of this stimulation with pornography in particular is this immediacy of it, and then when they're in the real world, there's almost like this fear of, I don't know how to respond, I don't know how to act, this discomfort.
I don't know what to do in the real world anymore.
I don't know what to do in the relationships are uncomfortable.
This is the detachment, where we've spoken about the detachment that happens.
If you have structured a large part of your life around your pornography use, you can be passing perfectly well in the world, even in relationships, at work and so forth. But if you are viewing day in, day out, 1 hour per day, that's a big, if your life is in some way balanced around that, however precariously, of course you're going to be scared of letting it go. Will I fall apart or whatever? But I think pastorally we need to be, and I do recall a priest friend of mine saying to me a couple of years ago that it's wonderful to see when you have someone in the confessional or in the pastoral counselling situation who's struggling with pornography, and you manage to convey to them that your desire for them and what you can actually realistically hold out to them is the possibility of greater freedom. And he said you can sometimes see the light coming into their face, and they're almost reluctant to believe it. They haven't tasted it yet, but they're beginning to get a sniff of the possibility of freedom, and that's your inroad there,
One of the other things that contributes to that lack of being able to commit to want is time. If it's been a long duration, if this is something that's been normative for them for many, many years of their life, if it's crossed over from childhood to teenage years to young adulthood, even into marriage, it's been a part of every facet of my life. And one of the things I oftentimes counsel people with many different things that they're holding on to that are sinful or a struggle is that it's important for us to take them to the cross, but also to leave them there. Because oftentimes when something has become such a part of us, we do show and tell with the Lord. Lord, here's my struggle, but you know what? It's so much a part of me. I'm going to take it back and go back to my life. Well, you've reached one important part. You've brought it to a place where help can be sought. But if you continue to take it back with you and don't have that change of life on a spiritual level, on a just relational level in the lived experience, it's not going to happen, and that also can contribute to that white knuckle reality.
I think as well, like when people who fall into addictive behaviours of various kinds, we're talking specifically about pornography, it's a quick fix for loneliness, for isolation, for whatever. But we can't replicate the quick fix in recovery. Recovery is never a quick fix. So you can take that sort of a addictive thing of the quick fix, here it is, the substance, the behaviour, and we're sorted for a while. But recovery doesn't work that way. It's a long, slow fix, and it's a gradual approaching of complete wellness. But it's not as you say, it's a process.
Yeah. And actually, I just had a thought as you were talking about that. It's a long journey. Mm-hmm. Like with the marathon, people are running, and then along the way, people are handing them, giving them water. In a sense, the person is running. And I think back to what Patricia was saying, you said that they're ready to do the work. They do need to do the work, but recognizing that they're not alone in that. They need to be fed appropriately on the way.
And I think one of the other things is a reminder that there are certain things in our life that we can be separated from once we've come to that conclusion that we want to be done with it. And then there's other things, like, for instance, again, it's because it's more commonly known, a person with the struggle with alcoholism has to stay away from alcohol. The same thing with this is that if a person goes down the road and they start to be convinced, oh, I'm cured, and they aren't vigilant anymore, they can easily backslide into this. So don't waste your time necessarily on saying, I'm never going to have this concern. That's where I need to be, is I never have this concern anymore. No, it's knowing that the concern is always there, but I have the tools ready to address it if the temptation comes on to say no to it, because my wholeness of myself has been restored to me because of my recovery.
And can't that also mean, Kielty, that a relapse is not necessarily a disaster? It can be embraced as part of the process. A relapse is an element of the process rather than the end of the process.
Yes.
Would that be right?
Absolutely.
Now, I have clinically, in relation to other addictions, I always get worried when people say to me, say in relation to alcohol, I've absolutely no interest in alcohol anymore. And that really rings alarm bells for me, because with recovery, you accept that at times you will be tempted, but you're able to manage that situation. When people are blasé about it, I think, no, this isn't good news.
Father Allen, if somebody is listening to this when it goes out and they think they have, they're watching porn and they think they might have an addiction, is there an online questionnaire that they might be able to take?
I think one of the things that we talk about, and we brought this concept up before, is that secrets lose their power when they're no longer a secret. And so one of the things that's important is to not get into the process of self-diagnosis, but to seek out the help that's there. Like, for instance, at Integrity Restored, we have the Integrity Coaching Circle, which is the ability to have that access to coaches who can help a person along, and that also becomes a triage point. But sometimes, when I go out and train priests, I give them some tools. So, for instance, we have the sexual addiction screening test. That is something that is out there that is able to be used. In addition to that, there's assessingpornaddiction.com that you can go on. And it's so interesting. We use the internet for the wrong things, but we don't use it for the good things that can help us from those wrong things. So, typing that in, there are plenty of tools out there that can assess what's going on in our life. We have to be honest about the questions that it asks. But again, I always caution that whole thing about self-diagnosis. Sometimes people come in and say, Father, I'm a porn addict. Well, how do you know? Well, because someone told me I was, or because I have this compulsion, so I think I am. Let the clinicians be in charge of the clinical diagnosis. If a person has a habit, if they're using, and it might be an addiction, there is help out there. Start by getting to those connections of persons who, and again, the church is a great resource for that, of going to a priest, for instance. But also, again, there are different people who are able to help. And I think the other thing to link this to, and we brought this up, is the website Fight the New Drug. They have this really neat thing that's called the Blueprint, where you can go on there as a person who's concerned about someone else's use of pornography. They have it set up from the perspective of, as a parent, you're concerned about your child. As a spouse, you're concerned about your spouse. And a couple other, as a friend, you're concerned about your friend. And as you go through it, ask qualifying questions, and it gives you some recommendations of how to address that person as well. So we are definitely getting up there where there's more and more resources for people who want to intervene on behalf of others and the person when they've come to the point where they said, I'm done with this. And so many different things, but I always caution against that. Self-diagnosis can sometimes be very destructive if a person does not have the support around them or the willfulness to then, okay, maybe I do have an addiction. What do I do with that? The word addiction is sometimes very suppressing if it's not guided through with the help of a proper clinician, especially.
We have been talking about the secrecy of pornography and it being hidden from partners and wives, spouses and so on. And I want to come to the issue here of a lot of times people are actually accidentally discovered, that a spouse discovers they're watching it. And there's this terrible reaction. Okay, and I just want to deal with this for a couple of minutes, because, the reactions of disgust and rejection and repugnancy and absurdity, and it's a get away from me and rejection, and I don't want to be near you. So I'm looking at this from two places. One is, where does the wife or the partner go, or the husband, we're talking about both sides here. Where can they turn to for help? That's one side of it. And the other side of it then is that when this discovery is made, how much of a setback is that person going to get by the reaction?
It's different for everyone. And one of the big things is that when disclosure happens, either the person does it willfully or it's found out. There's going to be a lot of emotions. The one big thing is to not respond immediately to those emotions. It has to have a moment to settle. And I'm talking in the immediacy. This is where words can be thrown out like addict and, people, I'm divorcing you or whatever the case may be. And so when that disclosure happens, again, there is help out there. We talk about betrayal trauma is what the spouse who is affected feels by their spouse's use. And this can also go for a significant other, or even parents can feel betrayal trauma over their child's use of pornography. And so we have the tools to be able to help others, and they're out there. But one of the big things we talk about is boundaries, because there is the boundaries that need to be set by the individual persons, the recovery for both persons individually, and then if they are in a relationship, whether it's the parent-child, whether it's the boyfriend-girlfriend, whether it's the husband-wife, to keep to those boundaries as they move forward and to make sure that they're wholesome, integrated boundaries. There are some clinicians out there who might say, oh, well, if a spouse is watching pornography, then the cure to this is that the two spouses just have more intercourse together. That is not the answer at all.
But Father Al, I'm just going to stop you there because I want to make the point of there needs to be a clinician involved in this recovery pathway to enable what you're talking about, to facilitate it.
There does. The facilitation through a clinician, but then there are also other helps out there. For instance, one of the things we have is Bloom for Catholic Women, or there's Bloom for Catholic women, or there's just Bloom if they don't want something spiritually based necessarily, or at least in the Catholic tradition, that is there as a support to women who are feeling that betrayal trauma so that they can be in a community themselves. So there's a multiple facet, because the other thing that you don't want is to immediately, in the embarrassment, the shame to set in that they feel isolated themselves. That was what got their spouse into that problem, and we don't want it to continue to perpetuate in the spouse affected.
I would just hold out a little note of caution on a certain type of witness, and without any cynicism at all, but there's a type of person who witnesses to their recovery and presents it all as a miracle of grace. And that can happen. I don't hold out, I don't block the possibility of miracles of grace. But for the vast, vast, vast majority of people, that simply doesn't happen. So if your only access to a witness to recovery is someone who is testifying only to the power of grace, I would say don't be misled by that, because you are going to have to do the heavy lifting.
Kielty, last question going to you. If a person is speaking to somebody who feels powerless over their pornography habit, what can a person say to them?
Like you said, if they are, if first reaction, if it's discovery, if somebody has, said, I'm doing this, admitted it, don't freak out. First thing is not to say, oh my God, is to actually don't freak out and listen. Say that must be difficult for you. But as well as that, probably the most important thing is to offer hope. And that support, if I have, let's say somebody opened up to me and I haven't got a clue what to do, but we say, you know what, we can start to discover what to do together. Or I've heard of this series. Let's take a look at it, or let me take a look, or maybe get some supports. So what you're doing is you're giving hope and not shaming. I can't believe that about you, because that's already happening for the person within themselves.
And it doesn't need to be embellished. Okay. All right. So we've come to the end of episode 11. And thank you for being here. Professor, you leave us on this one.
I do. And thank you for having me.
Well, it's been a great pleasure, and your insight has been much appreciated. Lovely working with you. Thank you so much.
And that wraps up another episode of The Porn Disaster. Thank you to our incredible panelists for sharing your expertise and insights. And to our listeners, thank you for tuning in and being part of this important conversation. If you've been impacted by anything we discussed today, know that help is available. Understanding leads to healing, and by shedding light on these tough topics, we are one step closer to positive change. Join us next time for another enlightening discussion. Until then, take care and stay curious.
Shalom World Podcasts is now available on all online platforms, including Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and others.